It's been too long, but here we are with another episode of the Tolkien Podcast. I have an additional episode nearly ready to record about J.R.R. Tolkien and World War I, but that's a pretty complex discussion, and I want to get it as right as I possibly can get it. And in the meantime, we have this timely topic for today's episode. The other night, while I was working on that Tolkien and the war topic, news crossed my path that had me checking the calendar. And I mean, I literally went to my calendar and checked to make sure it wasn't April 1st.
Well, hi, everybody. I thought it was time to give you all a Hunt For Gollum update.
You probably all heard Peter Jackson made headlines in the last few days and last week by announcing on Instagram that Stephen Colbert, who winds up his stint at CBS, an American television network with a long history, in May, and will be apparently unemployed, is developing a new Lord of the Rings film through New Line Cinema and Warner Brothers. Jackson was on the video originally to say that he would be updating the public with information about the Hunt for Gollum, fully titled The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum. I think every movie now will be titled The Lord of the Rings, something. Andy Serkis is directing that. I have a lot to say about that. Jackson said the film looks great, and he feels confident that it will be a really good film, and the script is in good shape. And of course, Jackson is a producer, so it's his project. He has some ownership, so of course he thinks those things. But while Jackson was there talking, providing the first of what he said would be many more video updates, more on that in a few minutes, he brought Colbert on from Colbert's office, presumably in front of some of Colbert's personal Tolkien items, including a cave troll figure that looks mighty familiar to me, and a Hildebrandt Brothers Tolkien print on the wall. It's in the deep background, but I'm fairly confident it's one called At the Grey Havens. Well, Colbert has a long association with nerd gear. That's something he's featured on his television shows for a long time, including a replica of Bilbo and Frodo's sword, Sting, that I'm confident you're all familiar with. So Jackson and Colbert talked about some ideas and some things. They never said the name Tom Bombadil, but Colbert, in his words about what inspired him to want to make this film, made it absolutely clear, no doubt, for good or for ill, that's the film that we can expect to see. So let's talk about it. My name is Larry Curtis, and you are listening to the Tolkien Podcast. A reminder, and I am not asking for your hand in marriage here, but I am told that you subscribing to the Tolkien Podcast helps the Tolkien Podcast. Now, being honest, I probably dislike asking for that as much as you dislike me asking for it, probably more. But apparently this is the currency that I need to grow the Tolkien Podcast. My second ask is that if you like what you hear here, tell one other person about the Tolkien Podcast. Word of mouth is really invaluable. Now, in my version of a perfect world, I would cover Tolkien news all the time and on all the places. But alas, in the meantime, I can't. So I would really love to hear from you. Love your support in whatever way you can. But if you want to drop a line via email, I would love to hear suggestions, tips, things I could do better, things you'd love to hear, whatever it is. Hello would be fine. TheTolkienPodcast@gmail.com. So we're really here to talk about a big Tolkien movie announcement. It's called The Lord of the Rings, The Shadow of the Past. But what it really should be called is The Lord of the Rings, the Tom Bombadil movie, because that is what it is. So let's set the stage for that announcement. Now, I don't know if you are the type of person, the audience out there, who follows the development process of films. I don't know if anyone wants to know what's coming in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or who's working on what, but I do. I like to follow those things. The Hunt for Gollum film right now is in what's called pre-production. Pre-production means that the team is hard at work on the film. They're kind of imagining and planning and especially designing the film. It's a concept stage, an imagination stage, a mapping stage, really a design stage. So in the video, we're Peter Jackson, we call him Jackson a lot, or Pete, where Peter Jackson was speaking with Stephen Colbert. It's now on the official Warner's YouTube channel, by the way, and it's vertically shaped, so shaped for Instagram. So that's really where it started, I'm pretty sure. Pete says the gang is all getting back together on that video. So the gang includes Gino Acevedo, who is an American from Arizona. I'm pretty sure. Didn't look that up, but I'm pretty sure. And he has been in New Zealand for, I don't know, like 20 years, maybe 30 years, actually. He's a social, fun guy. I believe last time I was there, he was starting a burrito joint, because there's not one thing New Zealand does not have is good Mexican food, or really any Mexican food. But we like Gino Acevedo, and he's been doing what he loves now for ages. And during that time, he's worked with the legends of prosthetics and special effects makeup like Stan Winston and the team of Weta, of course, of where he's been a massive part. He's been part of that team. So he is working on Andy Serkis's film. The gang also includes John Howe. Now, as many of you know, Alan Lee and John Howe were among the most well-known Tolkien artists in the world. At least they were in the late 1990s. And Jackson hired them to join him in New Zealand to draft and design landscapes and structures and, but to imagine the film, to take the script, imagine what it looks like, and sketch things out. They certainly were not the only concept people working on those films, but they were a massive part of it. And they made mighty contributions. I'm pretty confident that initially this was probably for a limited time, like, hey, come down here and work on the pre-production of these films and get ready to go. But as they ramped up filming, and as New Zealand kind of turned into Middle Earth production, they stayed and stayed. Now, of all the smart things that Pete Jackson did for the Lord of the Rings films, in my humble opinion, this was among the very smartest things that he did to bring Howe and Lee there. It was cost effective to have them in New Zealand to talk with the design team, to be on site, to change plans as needed, to be in the same time zone, and to create the look and feel of how the Rings films would look. And because they were Lee and Howe, they closely resembled the look of Middle Earth in books. Alan Lee, of course, illustrated The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and I'm not sure if he's done the Silmarillion actually, but he's done The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, illustrated versions of those. And John Howe has been in Tolkien calendars and places for a long time. Now, those guys helped create how Middle Earth looks to many, many millions of people, how Middle Earth looks on film. They created that. This is a big part of why when audiences sat down and watched, the highly anticipated Fellowship of the Ring comes and audiences go to watch. It is like back in the year 2000. Most people said, wow, that's exactly how I pictured it. But audiences kind of didn't realize is they had already been looking at Middle Earth. And those seeds, those impressions that were planted in their brains because of Howe's artwork and Lee's artwork and Ted Naismith's artwork. So when they sat down and watched the films, it was more a case of like, wow, I pictured it like that because Christopher Tolkien improved the art by John Howe and Alan Lee and Garland and Naismith for use in books and calendars. And that planted seeds in my imagination. So that's just what I already was looking for. That's why it all seems so familiar to us from the moment we watch. Now, very, very clearly, the Rings of Power series followed the same visual templates from the Jackson films, because that had been established in the minds of the public. That's what Middle Earth looks like. Those films followed the template of Lee and Howe and others and put those seeds in Middle Earth people's brains. Howe, in fact, is a concept designer for the TV series, so he just kept on working. So I mentioned in the opening that the Hildebrandt brothers are on Colbert's wall. Guess that's a tease. Well, we're going to pay that tease off. The picture behind him is a signifier about Colbert. It actually tells us something about him. He said it's part of his collection. So it's a clue that his fandom stretches back longer than the Howe and Lee and Ted Naismith era, which I think kicked up in the 1980s, mid 80s, late 80s. 70s Tolkien popularity was really building kind of everywhere, but in the mass market of the United States, one of the ways it was building was from the unauthorized Ace paperback editions of The Lord of the Rings. If you get your hands on some of those, which I do have, there's not really a copyright date on them. They just say that they're just published. And the claim was that Tolkien's publishers had never used the paperback market, so they could legally publish them in paperback because HarperCollins or whoever it was, I think it was HarperCollins in the UK at least, wouldn't be hurt because they don't do paperbacks. So Tolkien was mad. The publishers are mad, and they wrote a cease and desist. But those books served the purpose that they were passed around all over college campuses and probably just all over in the United States. So in the early 70s, Tolkien's popularity was building, partly because of those books and the controversy. And then Tolkien passed. He died in September of 1973, September 2nd, 1973. And that is the same year that the first annual Tolkien calendar was published. Surely Tolkien knew about the calendar, but he was kind of already tired of fans. It may have been a good time for him to get out, actually, before things got crazy. But that calendar, he knew about the calendar, surely, but he could just not have had any idea what that calendar would actually become. It was a big deal in the calendar world, believe it or not. Many Tolkienites around the world to this day buy the Tolkien annual calendar every single year. It's a good tradition. So that was 1973. In the following 2 years, 74 and 75, I have not really seen those two calendars, but as I understand it, it's a collection of Tolkien artists that definitely contains some of the work of Tim Kirk, and almost certainly you have seen some of Tim Kirk's Tolkien stuff. The piece I'm most familiar with is a tall Gandalf towering over Bilbo. But if you love Tolkien, it's highly likely that you have seen some of that Tim Kirk work, and that's kind of the era it came from. But in 1976, the calendars took a big step in a different direction. They took a leap, you could even say. But the Hildebrandt brothers' art was the source of the art for 1976. And it was also the art for 1977. And it was also the art for 1978. So as Tolkien fandom was exploding all over the place, but definitely in the United States and the UK, there were the Hildebrandts to give the visuals for what people were imagining in the books as they read. And actually, if you ever do get the Ace paperback editions, you can Google them too. They have really crazy covers. So they needed the Hildebrandt brothers to settle things down just a little bit. So in 77, the Silmarillion was published. And so the start of the expansion of the Tolkien library is off and running, which calls for more art and certainly more scenes and more characters and more moments and legends and monsters to draw and to paint, which is and was awesome in its scope. Let's actually sidebar for a minute. So when the Silmarillion was first published in 77, a Tolkien illustration was on the cover, which makes a lot of sense. They didn't know how this book was going to do. First of all, it was a little risk, but then they didn't have to pay somebody. They probably did have to pay the Tolkien estate, come to think of it, but they didn't have to go find a fantasy author and have them read this book and pick out a scene and do all the work. They could just put a Tolkien design, which was related to the elves and Galadriel. But 2 years later, in 1979, there was a Ballantine paperback edition. These were the first ones that I saw as a kid. There was a Hobbit, Lord of the Rings in 3 books, and a Silmarillion. The Silmarillion was gold. And that illustration is by Darrell K. Sweet, who has passed on these days, but he did fantastic images of the fall of Numenor, maybe the best. He was great with landscapes and destruction, I guess. Ted Naismith is widely seen now as the guy who illustrates the Silmarillion. He did the illustrated Silmarillion for HarperCollins with a bunch of his paintings inside. But Tolkien was the first guy to illustrate Tolkien's Silmarillion. Now, for real, all of this does relate to the announced movie. Remember, we are speaking about John Howe, who's working on the movie, right? So it gets us into this. How did John Howe become the visionary? How did Alan Lee become the visionary of what Middle Earth looks like? In 1979, there were 2 Tolkien calendars, so that's a tricky year. There was a Ralph Bakshi animated movie, and there was a calendar, a rotoscoped movie, animated movie. So that year there were 2 Tolkien calendars, and I don't want to do a year by year, but it was after this. It was in the 1980s that the mood departed from the Hildebrandt brothers and transitioned, shall we say, into like these kind of more realistic and more heavy, emotionally heavy artists like Ted Naismith and John Howe and Alan Lee. And these guys in the 80s then became synonymous with Tolkien, as did Roger Garland, who was another guy who was in the mix. Definitely worth looking up. I think now Garland is a little bit forgotten, maybe a lot bit forgotten, or he's undiscovered by current Tolkien audiences. But he provided the cover illustrations for The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, and most of the History of Middle-earth series. There's lots of covers of lots of those books, but he did all of those, which is, I don't know, pretty impressive hat trick of some kind, plus more. So he's a massively important Tolkien artist, and I have wondered often if Jackson has ever reached out to him back in 98, 99. Boy, that train just sounded again. But I've never asked Jackson about it. And Garland passed away in 2017. So unfortunately never got to talk to him or interview him. And so I don't know. What this all leads back to is that when Jackson started trying to do concept art, remember he was on a little bit of budget constraints for a while, and 2 movies was the plan for a while. He ended up with Alan Lee and John Howe. And I know for sure that Ted Naismith was also invited or asked to come. There's the train again. It sounds so haunting. I hope that appears on mic. Ted Naismith was also asked to go to New Zealand. I know this because Ted Naismith said so. He told me so. He is Canadian, and perhaps a little relaxed lifestyle. He decided not to commit to that long experience of those 3 movies. Anyway, John Howe and I had a good talk a couple of times on the Hobbit set as well. There was a late night shoot, Lake Town. There was a bunch of fire involved. It was a special effects heavy night, and Andy Serkis was there with the second unit, and Peter was there with the first unit. They were there together, and they don't often do that. It's not an efficient. I mean, they communicate often, but they're not both there for the shoot. And Andy's daughter was being an extra in a boat, and Pete's daughter Katie was an extra in a boat, and anyway, all kinds of things. I ended up on a scissor lift, and John Howe was there. We had a nice talk. I like that guy a lot. And anyway, there's all the stunt stuff and fire stuff going on, and there's John Howe, and it's you're kind of starstruck. But the world, it doesn't matter if he's a nice guy or not. It does matter actually, but it doesn't matter to the movie. But he is. But the world loves his art, and I love his art, and he is working on Andy Serkis's movie, and that's probably a massive plus for the film right out of the gate. So I would take a little time and enjoy some of John Howe's work online. One of my favorites of his is Ulmo, Lord of the Waters. You can Google that exactly. Ulmo, Lord of the Waters. That's, again, just personal preference, but one of the great John Howe. So Alan Lee has also done like illustrated Lord of the Rings and illustrated Hobbit, like these really nice versions. And Howe is, as we've just demonstrated, he's absolutely one of the essential Tolkien guys, but he's not done those books. And then Naismith kind of has the Silmarillion tied up. So Howe has done illustrations in all those books, and he's done covers, and he's done all these things, but he's never done like the John Howe illustrated The Hobbit book. Key person returning in Peter Jackson's video is Dan Henna. He's on the video, and he is leading the art department. He definitely knows how to run that art department. He's a guy Andy Serkis is super familiar with, probably close friends, actually. I don't know that for sure, but Dan Henna won an Oscar for set decoration on Return of the King, but he was nominated for all 3 Rings films, and there weren't a ton of nominations for Fellowship and for The Two Towers, and yet he was nominated all 3 times, and he was nominated for King Kong. It is really interesting to think about New Zealand, the New Zealand film world, and it's pretty remarkable that Peter Jackson and Richard Taylor and Dan Henna were all kind of born at about the same time and were able to really give their art and their abilities to these Middle-earth films and to the the not Hollywood film industry there in New Zealand. The Wellywood, they sometimes call it for Wellington. But he's a really nice guy, Dan Henna is. He treated me well. He gave me a ride, in fact, one day to the Dale set that was up on a hill. It was the post-Smaug Dale, all ruined and burned and pretty cool. Andy Serkis is, of course, directing the film, and Peter and his usual team are producing. And what that usual team means is there's lots of people who kind of are producers at different levels, or managers, or planners at all kinds of levels. So that whole team, very stable, very knowledgeable, very they were filmmakers. They know how to make films. All those people that are there, and they're there to support the vision of Andy Serkis. That team also includes Philippa Boyens as a writer, but there are some other writers that are there, which are names you are probably not familiar with. So I'm going to make you familiar with them. One of those is Phoebe Gittins, and I do not claim to know that's how you say her last name for sure. And there's a gentleman named Artie Papagorgiou, and I definitely know that's not how you say that name. So we'll call him Artie. But I do not know those people. I've not met them, and I have not heard them talked about, and I don't know what kind of writers they are, and I think that's a really, really important part of the film. But I do know some of the films they worked on, so I can at least give you some background about that. Gittins was a production secretary with the second unit on the Lovely Bones film that Peter Jackson and company did. So she's in work environment. I'm sure an aspiring writer and trying to do what she can to move up, but there she was as a second unit secretary. So Gittins and Artie were both writers on War of the Rohirrim. I guess we have to fully title these things The Lord of the Rings, The War of Rohirrim film. Together, they directed a 2013 film which is called The Sorrows. And this is not a film that anybody can watch anywhere as far as I'm aware, because I really tried. It is not on Tubi. It is not on a streaming service. It is not on YouTube. It is not on Amazon for money. It's not anywhere that I could find. If anybody has ever seen it, please let me know. I'm sure it played at some film festivals. At some point, somebody's seen it. 2013, The Sorrows. But they wrote that and made that film. So they're fresh off the Rohirrim movie and are writing for The Hunt for Gollum. Now, fans seem to like War of the Rohirrim okay, but critics did not. And I don't know that I'm a fan or a critic. I'm a fan critic or a critic fan or a guy with a podcast, but I was pretty disappointed with that finished film. I know there are people who like anything that says The Lord of the Rings on it, and they're such dedicated fans that they feel like they're going to love that thing. I do not feel that way. I feel like anything that is adapted and has The Lord of the Rings in the title, be it a card game or a board game or a calendar or a movie, it has a pretty heavy burden to aim for greatness. And as a consumer, I'm going to insist on that quality. And so things that are not of excellence, that I don't consume them. I think they need to do better. And I think the people who make films, the gateholders, need to hear that fans demand quality and not quantity. Be that as it may, there are people who love a thing, and I never want to tell a person they shouldn't love a thing. So my taste is my own, and that's all I can go by. But I didn't love War of the Rohirrim. I really did like the concept, though. I liked the idea that a woman would be the lead protagonist, and I liked that it was set kind of in the days of lore around Lord of the Rings, that it didn't really have hobbits. I hope it didn't have any. I hope it didn't. I can't remember any. But the execution of it was kind of middle of the road and not so much Middle Earth. I also, as a person who writes, know that writing is hard, and that writing a great script is hard, and it's not always up to the writer how the script is made into a film. Far from it. So it's not fair to say, well, I didn't like that film, they're not good writers. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the finished product didn't do it for me. But those are the hands that we're in for this Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum film that Andy Serkis is giving his heart and soul for right now, hopefully with a absolutely rip-roaring, bang-up script that will blow all of our minds. So there's all the background for the announcement, and I'm about to talk about Bombadil, but there's one more thing, one more sidebar I want to talk about for a quick note about The Hunt for Gollum. There is a 40-minute film on YouTube, it's there right now, called The Hunt for Gollum. When I was the Tolkien track director for Dragon Con in Atlanta, this was, of course, before the convention decided that, despite almost entirely full rooms for every bit of Tolkien programming that it had, that they wanted to fold Tolkien fandom in the high fantasy track. Boo Dragon Con, and I really do mean that boo. They were developing what could have been, should have been, or was the premier Tolkien convention programming in the country, and maybe anywhere. They really could have built something special, but they didn't understand that Tolkien popularized dragons in our day and age, and that they kind of ridiculously are called Dragon Con, but they didn't support the greatest and the baseline fantasy franchise of the last 2 centuries, upon which all the others are built. But I digress. That's a sidebar on the sidebar. Back in the day, we programmed this movie, The Hunt for Gollum, that you can watch on YouTube, as a late night screening to, watch. So Dragon Con's pretty fun because it goes on basically 24 hours a day in the hotel somewhere. You can go find something to do almost anytime, maybe between 4 and 8 a.m. It gets a little slow, but it was pretty fun. That's me boycotting it for dropping Tolkien. But the fan film, it's entirely made by fans, and it's not done for profit. It's no one was paid. Nobody did anything for money, which is why it's allowed to stay up on YouTube. Warner Brothers could absolutely, and I think maybe did for a short time, but they could have it taken down. They would just need to ask YouTube once and it would be gone. But instead, they've allowed it to remain up for around 15 million clicks, and in about 15 years, one of those numbers is slightly off, but that's approximately at a decade and a half. The film has like a no budget version of Viggo Mortensen and also a no budget version of Liv Tyler. And I'm not saying that to disparage anybody, but we're talking about like kind of bad wigs. It's what they could afford. Wigs are super, super expensive. Clothing that they could get that would feel kind of in touch with the Lord of the Rings that we know from the Jackson Lord of the Rings. Good wigs, by the way, are really expensive. High quality wigs are actually a sign of a big budget on a film. So, and the longer the hair on a wig, the more costly, the more expensive it becomes. So go look at Tauriel and the Hobbit films. And I mean, that is an expensive wig, probably worth more than cars that we drive. Not the nicest cars, but maybe more budget. Now that's no big deal for Warner's, but that's a very big deal for an independent film where nobody's paid and they're scraping money out of their wallet or out of their pockets to throw this together and to get a Gandalf beard and costume and find actors who can do these things. So I'm not in any way disparaging their efforts. In fact, I'm saluting them. I think they're awesome, but that's what you get. You're getting the free version of, Viggo Mortensen. But we not only do we forgive those bad wigs, we kind of celebrate them. That's kind of what makes it so great. It's really, anyway, go watch that. It's worth your time. It even uses the same font in the credits as the Peter Jackson trilogy for its credits. So I don't know, pure love for that thing here. So Peter Jackson hops on Instagram on the Warner's account, I think, to bring in Colbert and talk about this fresh Tolkien movie. Now, by the way, there had been rumors in the last few weeks that the Hunt for Gollum was going to be a trilogy of Tolkien films, which seemed, I don't know, weird, far-fetched. I mean, if it's about the Hunt for Gollum, there's not that much material. But what I think was happening, though, is this film was being talked about kind of below the surface, or people were dropping hints, and nobody could have imagined that the film being rumored was going to be a Stephen Colbert written film. So the fan press, which is really great at cannibalizing all the other fan press sites, and they do very little reporting. That rumor spread sort of fast, but it remains completely unconfirmed, and this probably answers what those were. I appreciated Colbert's humor and intelligence for years and years, as maybe many of you have. But I will admit that I have had a little trouble maybe swallowing some of the things when he declares that he's the ultimate fan, or maybe a media outlet does that, and he's the ultimate scholar. Like, he's both of those things, which probably neither of those things is true. And that's not to disparage him, but like Dominic Monaghan gets on TV and tries to stump him on air with "Who is Shelob's mother?" and then Dominic's mind is blown when Colbert mentions Ungoliant. I'm sure he's better at trivia than I am, but there are both huge fans who aren't able to get on network television. There are also Tolkien scholars who write like dissertations and things like that. So I don't know. Anyway, when I see Colbert on my phone, I literally paused the video and I checked my calendar. I walked to my planner and checked my calendar because it was close to April 1st. I don't really track the days that much, but I was like, wait, is this real? But I saw it wasn't April 1st. In fact, it was like 5 days away, and I accepted, no, this is not a joke. Now, I don't know if Stephen Colbert is a good screenplay writer. I think he's a good comedy writer for sure, comedy sketch writer, and I don't know how much. I don't know his process. I wouldn't claim to have any idea of the process, but I know like late night talk shows have a team of people writing jokes. His job is to deliver, but I think in his earlier television career, he was probably more of a writer, and he's definitely smart. He's definitely clever. But then he says that he's talking to his son, who's also a screenwriter who we've never heard of. And that doesn't mean he's not good either. No one's heard of me as a screenwriter, but I happen to think I've written a couple of good features. So anyway, this gives me pause when he says that his son is also part of this thing. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying they're not good at this, but I am saying it's hard to know if they're good at this or not. I don't know. And I guess that's why, for insurance reasons, not literal insurance, but that's why they pair them with Philippa Boyens, who is proven to have written successful movies about Middle-earth. One thing we absolutely know about Colbert and absolutely believe is how much Tolkien really means to him. He's completely sincere, I think, maybe on everything, but clearly in that realm, he's absolutely sincere. And he says on the video how much both the Tolkien books meant to him and how much the Peter Jackson movies meant to him. And I appreciate those things. So here is Colbert talking about how he plans to approach this film.
Faithful to the books while also being completely faithful to the movies that you guys had already made.
But I'm watching that and I'm still feeling like I'm kind of having some doubts, and it's late at night and I'm wide-eyed and I'm wondering, man, am I watching the announcement of a disaster that's going to unfold? And then Colbert pitched his idea.
But the thing I found myself reading over and over again were the 6 chapters early on in the Fellowship that y'all never developed into the first movie back in the day. It's basically the chapter is 3 is Company through Fog on the Barrow Downs.
And with those words, Colbert won me over. This is such a good idea. It's so appropriate and such a full of possibilities and wonder. So a big load of apprehension melted for me. I think that sounds like such a wise, clever, intelligent, and funny, and it's just a good plan. The other thing is, Colbert I'm very self-conscious about my breathing on these podcasts. I'm afraid of my air intake. I'm afraid of how it sounds. It makes me self-conscious. I need to get over it. But in that clip, Colbert breathes how I breathed. So it made, I'm like, if I wasn't a fan already, I'm like, hey, that guy breathes like me. Maybe I'll be able to stay in this making free podcast business after all. So let's quickly talk about those 3 chapters. And if you haven't caught on, there's going to be spoilers. So if for some reason you haven't read the books, which is fine, but if you've just watched the movies and you've heard about some, this missing part, this is a missing part. This is what the movie is going to be about. So if you don't want to know, turn off now. In chapter 3, called 3 is Company, Frodo and Sam quietly kind of slip away from the Shire. They were waiting for Gandalf, or Frodo was waiting for Gandalf, but they felt they had finally delayed too long. And they were right. They had delayed too long and they had to go. They are soon joined by Pippin, and as they travel through the countryside, they feel uneasy, and they even spot some dark figures on some paths. Black riders begin to appear, and so familiar paths start to feel uneasy and haunted. That seems like a good opening to a movie. The group avoids roads, and they're cutting through fields and woods, and they have encounters with elves, and we get a taste of that in the extended editions. But in this edition, in this Colbert version, they have the option to really communicate with these elves. We start to also sense that the peril is not just for the Shire or for Frodo, but it's for Middle Earth. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4 is called A Shortcut to Mushrooms, which is a line straight out of Fellowship of the Ring, Peter Jackson's movie, which was definitely a reference to this chapter. But now we got the whole chapter. Frodo and Sam and Pippin are detouring through Farmer Maggot's land. Merry shouldn't have been there, as he was in the movies, but of course he was, because you're adapting a movie, and you of course he was there. That's just the only way to do it for a film. That's adaptation. So instead of Angry Maggot, back to the books, instead of Angry Maggot, they find an unexpected kind Farmer Maggot who feeds them and who is like really on their team. He offers some crucial information as well. A Black Rider has already been asking questions about Frodo. So the danger becomes more concrete. It's not vague. It's not shadows. It's not a figure on the road. It's not an uneasy feeling. It's a specific one now. And Maggot hides them and gives them a ride toward Buckleberry Ferry, which is a really fun thing to say. And Dominic Monaghan says it better than anybody. He stays ahead of the pursuit. Basically, Farmer Maggot is an agent for good. And so this is a nice chapter that blends humor and character, and we're going to get to know these guys with a little bit of mounting tension as well, while we still have the comforts of the Shire around us. Now, this chapter, or parts of it, do appear in the film. So the writers will have to be kind of clever, or as what I hope, they just stick to the book and explain in the film out loud that some tellings of the story have some of the details wrong. This would be kind of a little reference to Jackson's movies, and it would be brilliant and fun and funny, and I hope they do that. But I mean, that's my idea. I'm not writing the script. I'm sure they'll do whatever they deem best, but feel free to steal that writing team. By the way, part of the coolness of Colbert doing this is that the tone is a little bit lighthearted and funny compared to the bigger tale, appropriate for Stephen Colbert. Chapter 5 is called A Conspiracy Unmasked. In Buckland, Frodo is joined by Merry now. I don't know how that'll be handled, obviously. Frodo can kind of stop pretending about all these things because he's pretty much busted or outed by Merry and Pippin and Sam and Fatty Bulger. Fascinating idea that we may get a fifth Hobbit there for a minute. Reminds me of the Beatles, the fifth Beatle. Bulger, anyway, these guys explain that they know about the ring and they know about Frodo's departure and they're going to join him, and so he's not alone, and he was kind of worried. So that's the unmasked conspiracy. It's a shared mission among friends. Now, I teased that I'm working on a Tolkien and World War I podcast, which is coming up. It's kind of complex and hard. Consider this a tease, but when Tolkien was at Oxford in 1914, the United Kingdom went to war with Germany. It's called World War I. Most of the males at Oxford enlisted. That's where Tolkien was. Famously, Tolkien was part of the Inklings with C.S. Lewis later in his life, but long before that, at Oxford, he was in what's called the TCBSs, or the Tea Club and Bavarian Society. By the time Tolkien enlisted, the last of his friends to do so, because he was really poor and he had to finish school, the TCBSs were kind of for friends taken from their innocent youth in quiet lands, all four sent off to terrible war in foreign lands. Now make of that what you will. I'm just telling you some facts about 1914 and Tolkien. In the other thing important about chapter 5, before I go on to chapter 6, this meeting, this friendship, this declaration that we're with you until the end, it's really deliberate. And so it sort of changes from Sam and Frodo just fleeing to the first real kind of fellowship of the ring, if you will. And with this fellowship comes danger, which is close at hand. On to chapter 6, the Old Forest. The hobbits enter the Old Forest. They enter a place where the natural world feels kind of scary and hostile and watchful. The trees, if you'll remember, or if you haven't read, seem to move with real intent. Peter Jackson definitely echoed this in some of his wooded parts in the Two Towers off the top of my head, but that's not unusual. And then obviously in the extended editions, we learn just how mobile and how watchful and how active those trees can be. But in this part of this book, they seem to be guiding the hobbits and hemming them in and moving them towards the Withywindle Valley. And there in the Withywindle Valley is an ancient willow tree. There's some cool entomology about that. I was tempted to sidebar, but I avoided it for you because this is so crazy long. The ancient willow tree traps them and almost destroys them, kind of revealing that the forest is older than we think, and stranger than we think, and that life outside of the Shire is unpredictable and scary. It does give kind of a feeling of this could actually not work. This could actually fail. The rescue comes from the unexpected form of Tom Bombadil, a mysterious figure. He's untouched by the forest's kind of malice and outside of the laws of Middle-earth, if you will. I've been on the record before. I don't think it makes me unique. I don't think it's a brave take. I don't think it's revolutionary, but it's a really great thing that Tom Bombadil was not in the Peter Jackson movies. From an adaptation standpoint, he doesn't advance the plot. He's not has nothing to do with the goal that Frodo has. We need our protagonist and his friends to be focused. We don't want to spend yet more time walking. Tom doesn't make sense. It really was a wise decision not to include him in those films, even as an extended scene. But I know that Peter Jackson has been asked over and over and over, and fans who are well-intentioned will complain on forums and say, hey, he didn't even put Bombadil in the movie. Or I don't know. So, but people have been talking about it for 25 years. So chapter 7, in the house of Tom Bombadil. In Tom's home, the hobbits find a little bit of sanctuary in this old forest. They find tales, they sing, they have songs. Hippie counterculture in the 60s and 70s would say they were probably high or experiencing some hallucinogen, but it is a little weird in Tom's house. Pretty confident that's not what Tolkien meant. Bombadil is an enigma created by Tolkien, and he's sort of out of Middle-earth while he's in Middle-earth. And I don't know. Let's talk about chapter 7. You're about to get too much opinion. I doubt that Colbert will make any reference to the 60s or the 70s counterculture, but that is what people thought in those days. Tom's power, it's kind of peculiar. He handles the ring. This is full of spoilers, so sorry. I told you, I did warn you. He handles the ring, the One Ring. Frodo, he knows about it. Frodo lets him hold it, and he's not in the slightest bit affected by it. He even makes it vanish as if it's a toy, as if it's just a trick of a magician. In the safety, though, there's this bizarreness that I mentioned, and it's clear that Tom exists beyond the concerns that drive the rest of the story, which is another reason don't put him in the Jackson movies, right? He's outside of these things. I'm sure I said a minute ago that he doesn't really have an impact on the ultimate outcome of the conflict or what's going on. So the other thing he would do is probably confuse people, and they would bring up questions like they do already about the Eagles. Why didn't the Eagles just fly Frodo to the volcano? So movie folks would be asking why Tom didn't just keep the ring or make it disappear or teleport it. I don't know, because Tom's pretty powerful. So all of those things are wisely avoided. But now Colbert, very clearly is going to revisit them, and that's pretty cool. Chapter 8 is called Fog on the Borrowed Downs. So these hobbits leave Bombadil's house and they enter what's called the Borrow Downs. And we're not given a ton of context for what these are. It's just this place which gives us this sense that this Middle Earth is full of things, full of wild things. This particular area is filled with ancient burial mounds. It's another way that Master Tolkien is making us feel the ancient age of Middle Earth. And of course they get lost, and of course they are ensnared by a Borrow-wight, which is... we don't see the thing. It's a long white arm. It's a chilling remnant that there's an older age of Middle Earth. There's a darker age of Middle Earth. Well, our friend Frodo, our main character, our protagonist, except actually it's Sam, but don't tell anyone. But Frodo resists, and as he calls, I think he sings, but he shows his strength to resist this Borrow-wight, and he calls for help. And so Tom Bombadil, who is still in his realm, that he never leaves, by the way, Rings of Power show, he never leaves. Tom returns to rescue these hobbits with a song. Again, this is just going to prompt people to say, why didn't Tom just sing Cira Thungol into ruins? Why didn't Tom just sing the Black Gate to fall on the ground? Well, whatever happens, it does create a little tiny bit of conflict with the film. So for one of the big gets the Hobbit manage out of this Barrow Down, out of this rescue that they get, they pick up some swords, which are really, really important, ancient swords and powerful. But we've already seen in film canon that they already have little swords. I think they were gifts. So it's going to be kind of a little hard to explain, but the writers are pretty smart. So with a little wink and a nod, I would just tell on the other movie, which maybe didn't get all the details right. It's a way to have fun with this other film, but doing it purely from inside the film appropriately as characters. I think it's a cool idea. But it's just, I like the idea, of course, because it's my idea, but they will have their own ideas and they will handle these things their own way, which will be the determining factor is how good they are. But what it should do is tell us what is kind of happening in the Fellowship of the Ring, but between the frames, the things we've already seen. We're going to find out they did some other things that ultimately didn't matter in the big picture, but were really interesting in the small picture. It's a good story. It has goals, it has clear goals. It has action. It fits with the Gang of Four going off to war. So I think it really might work. I will say I looked around at the interwebs to see how people reacted, and Reddit didn't like this idea at all. Not at all. Colbert said in the interview that he had this idea. He scraped together his courage and he talked to Pete, and Pete liked it. And then with support, they presented the idea, I think maybe just Colbert, but he got an audience, to New Line Cinema and then to Warner Brothers. According to Colbert, they loved it. So the question is, why did they love it? Well, because it makes a lot of sense and it makes a lot of business sense. Currently, there is a IMDb, the Internet Movie Database page for the movie called The Lord of the Rings: Shadow of the Past. That is, of course, the title of Chapter 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring book, but that's a fine title for the movie as well. Variety reported from that page, or they reported that the film has a summary that's the same as what's that page, and that's a little slightly more accurate way for me to say it. But they said they reported it as real, as legit, like that's it. And so, of course, it's been re-reported over and over. I think Deadline reported the same thing, so it's pretty good. And this is pretty likely exactly what Warner Brothers wanted there and put there. I'm going to read it to you. 14 years after Frodo's passing, Sam, Merry, and Pippin set out to retrace the first steps of their adventure, while Sam's daughter, Eleanor, is determined to uncover why the War of the Ring was very nearly lost before it even began. End quote. I looked all over the internet for an official page or anything else that might be official other than the IMDb entry. IMDb is like a bit of a wiki. Like I could enter info on there and you can, if you just, so this, I thought it was possible somebody made this page, but it does not look like that's the case. This looks like it's legit, like it's real from the studio. It has no photos on it, and I don't see anywhere that says it's official, but is being reported if it is, and everything about it fits. So it lists Colbert, Boyens, Colbert's son, Peter McGee as writers. It says that it stars Billy Boyd and Ali Aston. Ali Aston, of course, has done some film work. She has credits. She has experience, including in a feature film, at least one. Jackson loves to include cameos and family in frame if he can. So way back in the day, Ali, of course, played Sean Astin's daughter in the final scenes of The Return of the King when Sam uttered the most important thematic lines, "Well, I'm back." Ali was there. She's in the movie, so her character is named in the synopsis. She's named as an actress, and who better to use in the framing device than that same little girl that Peter Jackson managed to get at the very end of the movie, but now she's all grown up. I would suspect that Uncle Pippin will be telling a tale to her about her dad or about the Fellowship, the unknown adventure they had back in the day when 4 hobbits rode off to tackle the Dark Lord Sauron, and being silly about Tom Bombadil. So that's all set up. Jackson dropped an absolute bomb of a news nugget to announce that the movie is in development while Hunt for Gollum prepares to shoot. I made another promise in the preview that we would talk about Jackson and his little video announcements that he said he would make from time to time. So here is Pete.
The first of many that we'll do, little blogs along the way. And
years ago when he was doing the Rings movies, he knew, well, one, I think they were worried about, losing their shirt and losing everything, but also they thought they were doing something cool and they really wanted to get attention. So they realized the power of reaching out to fans. And he did that initially in a few places. Ain't It Cool News and TheOneRing.net are the two that I was the most aware of now. And then with the architect of all the behind the scenes content on those amazing home video editions of the movies, Michael Pellerin, he also did video diaries for King Kong, which were awesome. Jackson and even Universal didn't choose a big corporation to do those video diaries. He chose a fan site. So Kong is King might still exist. I should have looked, but I don't know. KongIsKing.net existed only because Jackson told Mike at The One Ring, hey, I'm going to make videos every week. Get a website for this King Kong thing so we can show fans what we're doing. And they did. And the videos were great. They were really, really good. And Universal supported this whole process. Not New Line Cinema, not Warner Brothers wasn't in the picture yet for Lord of the Rings, but Universal was really great. And they had all these great King Kong diaries with Pellerin and Jackson and participating. So when Jackson pops on Instagram to make a video and to tell fans, speak directly to fans, it's the same thing he's been doing for 30 years in a different way, in a little different format on a different platform. And it's really great, actually. I'm not sure that there's other directors do things, but I don't think quite this open and quite this directly. And now he doesn't even need the fan sites because Peter can just do these updates whenever he wants, and Warner Brothers has all the platforming and all the branding and everything in place to help him. I get the feeling that Pete might just do these updates on a smaller scale. He might just be mostly him talking, and he might have fans on. The King Kong diaries were like productions. They were like mini movies. They were making crazy 1 or 2 little mini movies every week. It was really something. But I don't think we'll be seeing that with these Lord of the Rings films. But he might bring on, I don't know, Colbert sometime. A guy with some time on his hands, or Circus, or Kate Winslet, or from the set, or an extra. I don't know. I wish I knew, and I hope that Pellerin is there with Circus helping out for these things, but I don't know. I haven't talked to Michael Pellerin in a long time, and some of these things, he's really invaluable back in the day. I just don't know what's happening now. By the way, everybody knows that Kate Winslet was wanted for Galadriel. Maybe not everybody knows that. So if not breaking news, Kate Winslet was originally wanted for Galadriel, and Jackson, if you'll recall, discovered Kate Winslet as a teen. She was 17 when he cast her in his film Heavenly Creatures, which was released in 1994, and that was her big break. Interestingly enough, that was also starring Melanie Lynskey, who has had quite a little renaissance lately. She was at college after that film, and she was working, but maybe not super high profile, but she is now really doing well. So it's funny that Jackson cast those 2 teen stars to do that heavy drama film, and they've both landed, they've done quite well. However, Melanie Lynskey is not in The Hunt for Gollum. and Kate Winslet is. So all these years after chasing Kate Winslet again, trying to redo the Kate Winslet thing with Jackson, now it's happening. Only Jackson's not directing now. Andy Serkis is. So Melanie Linsky did co-star in a movie with Elijah Wood, though. So it's a small world, isn't it? I bet they talked about Peter Jackson at some point while they were on set. Anyway, it will be super interesting to see how Jackson chooses to reach fans now. In 99, he needed nerds, but he just don't. And today, all the fan sites are professional fan sites. Again, The One Ring might be an exception, but I kind of dislike all of them. All these, they pretend to be fan sites, but they're so corporate and they have such clickbait headlines like the top 10 moments or the top 10 lists of Middle Earth. I just stuff that's designed to get you to click, and then you have to read a lot, and then it waits, and they do very little like real reporting. It's a lot of, hey, my take on this is this, which, kind of anybody can write. I don't know. If you love those things, then great. But mostly what I see it as, these sites are just eating each other and then vomiting back that work up. And Variety and Deadline actually report. And they also eat Variety and Deadline stories and vomit those back up, just rearranging the words. Like, it's really the same thing. They just swallowed it, barfed it up, and then it's just a slightly different thing. Another kind of gripe I have is they don't really pay their writers well, and I guess they don't really need to. They are writers, but they're regurgitators, so they're not doing anything but like mixing up somebody else's word salad, mixing it up, tossing it different. Anyway, that's enough about that. Before we go, I just wanted a few words about Andy Serkis. I'm sure many of you share this opinion, but this is a massively talented, genuine, caring, sensitive might even be the word, sensitive guy. I interviewed him in Utah ages ago in the back room of a bookstore. I don't think he remembered that. But on my second day on the Hobbit set, maybe the first day, maybe the third day, one of those early days right away, there were some relatives in this little area where I was kind of observing. They were relatives of one of the powerful people on set. So like they do for everyone, including me, but especially for relatives of their top people, the production wanted to take good care of them. So in the course of a couple of hours between takes and on breaks, I got the chance to chat and to know them pretty well. And the three of us got along well, which is fun because I'm in a new country and feeling a little alone. So Andy had a night shoot that night for Lake Town. And for sure, the production planned it for these guests, these relatives, but Andy came over to them and asked them in this waiting area we kind of were in, on set basically, but just off to the side, if they wanted to help him. He's like, hey, could you help me? Could you be extras? We need you. It was definitely not part of the plan, but he also saw me there and in the area. And so then he approached me and introduced himself and, said, hey, we're really shorthanded and you'd be doing me a huge favor if you could help out and be an extra during the night. So, of course, anyone would be thrilled to do this. And he knows that too. Like he wasn't fooling anybody for a second, but he was just so gracious about the thing. You can guess how long it took me to make that decision yes, I would of course be an extra in his shot that night. But he was as generous and gracious to me as just some guy. I'm just some guy there. And when he didn't need to be, there was nothing at stake. So later, in the States, he also remembered me and was friendly at a press conference or, just really, really decent guy. Gracious might be the best word, and considerate. And he was the same for King Kong film on the red carpet. Though he didn't know who I was then. This was obviously pre-Hobbit, but I was this guy with a camera, and everybody else had a camera. Everybody's pointing his face, but he was really gracious there too. And then I said, Kong is king. And anyway, he was a nice guy. So really, I value celebrities have all the money, all the the ones we're talking about, all money and wealth and all these things, and that means they can kind of do what they want. So how they treat people when they don't have to treat them any certain way is really telling. I feel like it's how I evaluate kind of what kind of character they have and what kind of person they are. And Andy Serkis is right up there among the best humans, and I can only cheer for this guy to succeed. And I mean that commercially and artistically. You just want things to go well for good people. And I'm sure he has a life, and I'm sure he has stressors. I'm sure he has hard days. I'm sure he has trouble. But on 0 of the days where I watched him film or interact with people, which turns out to be a lot of days with both the filming and a lot of Hobbit publicity and stuff, 0 of those days did he let anything escape his mouth or his actions that was anything but kind and considerate of people. So he is a fine actor, and not just for Gollum. He's had some really good roles and turned in really good performances. And he's obviously masterful with Gollum, and I think in film history that character and his work on it will grow in importance and respect. But I am saying very much he's a really excellent actor beyond that. And above all of those things, he's an excellent human. So it's impossible not to cheer for Andy Serkis to make a really great Hunt for Gollum movie. Go Andy. And not only go Andy, but the world is a strange place filled with strange events. And the fact that we will go to a Lord of the Rings movie coming out of New Zealand, the Peter Jackson camp, and it will feature prominently Tom Bombadil is enough to blow my mind. And hopefully your mind too. It's why it's fun to be a film fan. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. My name is Larry Curtis, and this has been the Tolkien Podcast.